woman in white. I've never been one for big New Year's Eve parties, but every year, my friend Darren's family throws a gathering at their house deep in the countryside. It's a tradition I've always looked forward to. Good food, good company, and a break from the usual chaos of the holiday. Their house is in an upscale neighborhood, but to get there, you have to drive through miles of dense, isolated back roads. That night, the air was frigid, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones. I had my brights on, something I usually avoid, but out there, in the middle of nowhere, they were necessary. The darkness pressed in on all sides, the road ahead barely visible beyond the glow of my headlights. The road was long and empty, except for one thing. At first, I thought I imagined it, a pale shape standing at the tree line ahead. As I got closer, my stomach tightened. It was a woman, dressed in a long white gown, completely inappropriate for the freezing night. She wasn't moving, wasn't waving for help, she was just standing. As I passed, something in my gut told me not to slow down. But curiosity got the best of me, and I glanced in the rearview mirror. She had turned to face me. She didn't move from that spot, didn't chase after the car, but the way she turned so smoothly, so deliberately, sent a chill up my spine. I had no idea what she was doing out there, alone in the cold, but I had no intention of stopping to find out. I arrived at Darren's house without incident, pushing the eerie encounter from my mind. The party was in full swing, laughter and music filling the house. I parked among the other cars in the gravel driveway and tried to shake the lingering unease. The hours passed. Midnight came and went, and soon people started heading home. I stayed behind to help clean up, as I usually did, chatting with Darren's parents and a few lingering guests. When I finally stepped outside to leave, mine was the only car left in the driveway. That's when I noticed something strange. A low tire pressure warning lit up on my dashboard. I wasn't too worried. Cold weather had a habit of messing with my tires, but as I started driving, I could tell something was wrong. The car wasn't handling right, and soon I heard it. A grinding sound, like metal scraping against the pavement. I pulled over onto the side of the road, my stomach twisting with dread. I knew it was a bad idea, but I had no choice. I had to check. The moment I stepped outside, I regretted it. The forest loomed around me, impossibly silent. Even the wind had stopped. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, scanning the ground. Every single tire was destroyed, not just deflated, ripped apart, as if something with claws had shredded them. Panic set in. I reached for my phone, knowing I had no service this deep in the woods. That's when I heard it. A snap, a twig breaking somewhere in the darkness. I froze. It was slow, deliberate, the sound of footsteps crunching over dead leaves. My heart pounded as I fumbled to turn off my flashlight. The darkness swallowed me whole. Then a voice. "I see you." I forgot how to breathe. The voice was soft, barely above a whisper, yet crystal clear. A woman's voice. I didn't move. I couldn't. Then another whisper. "Can you see me?" My survival instincts finally kicked in. My hands trembled as I turned the flashlight back on, aiming it toward the trees. And there she was, the woman in the white gown, standing right at the tree line. Up close, she looked inhuman. Her dress was filthy, covered in dark stains. Her skin was pale, almost gray, stretched tightly over her bones. Long, tangled hair hung past her shoulders. But it was her face that made my blood run cold. Her jaw, half of it, was gone. And yet, somehow she was grinning. The flashlight shook in my hands. I barely had time to process what I was seeing before she moved. She started running toward me. I didn't think. I bolted. My only thought was getting back to Darren's house. I ran like my life depended on it. The sound of twigs snapping and leaves rustling behind me. She was chasing me. I could hear her breathing, ragged and uneven. I forced myself to run faster, my legs burning, my lungs aching. I didn't dare look back. Somehow, I made it. I stumbled up the steps, pounded on the door, screaming for help. Darren's mom opened it, eyes wide with concern, and yanked me inside. I collapsed onto the floor, gasping for breath, trying to explain between frantic gulps of air. Darren and his father listened as I stammered out what had happened. They believed me. They called the police. I stayed the night, too shaken to even think about going back outside. But the nightmare wasn't over. At 3:14 a.m., I woke to a soft tapping on the window, the second floor window. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Then a voice, so quiet I almost thought I imagined it. "I see you." I clenched my eyes shut, praying it would go away. I didn't look. I wouldn't look. The tapping continued for what felt like hours. Then, just before dawn, it stopped. When morning came, Darren's dad went outside to check. Near the house, exactly where I had heard the voice, he found something chilling. A rusty knife, buried in the frost-covered grass. The police arrived later and I told them everything. They searched the area, even checked the old shack down the road, but no one was there. But they found something else. Dead animals. Dozens of them, scattered through the woods. Gutted. That woman, whatever she was never found. To this day, I don't know what she wanted. I don't know how she followed me. And I don't know why I could hear her voice so clearly, despite her missing jaw. All I know is that I'll be taking the long way around this year. Ride home. I've always been careful when traveling alone. I don't drink, I don't party, and I'm always hyper-aware of my surroundings. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened that night. I had just gotten back from visiting a friend in another city. My flight landed late, midnight to be exact. By the time I grabbed my bags and made my way to the taxi pickup area, it was closer to 12:30 a.m. I was exhausted and just wanted to get home. An old yellow minivan taxi pulled up when I waved one down. The driver was an older man, maybe mid-40s, with graying hair and a slight beard. He looked tired but friendly enough. He rolled down the window and asked where I was headed. When I told him, he nodded and said he'd take me for $30, which was cheaper than Uber. That should have been my first red flag. He stepped out, offering to load my bag into the trunk, but I told him I preferred to keep it with me. He didn't argue, just lifted it into the seat beside me. I settled into the back seat, diagonal from him, and we pulled onto the highway. The roads were mostly empty, save for the occasional passing car. The airport lights faded behind us, and soon it was just the dark highway stretching ahead. That's when I noticed something weird. The driver kept glancing at me through the rearview mirror. The first time, I ignored it. The second time, I started to feel uneasy. Then he spoke. "Where are you coming from?" I told him. He nodded, then asked if I had been visiting family. I said no, just a friend. "Your friend as pretty as you?" I froze. I forced a laugh, but the comment made my skin crawl. It wasn't the words themselves, it was the way he said them. His voice was smooth, too casual, like he had been waiting for the right moment to say it. I decided to keep my answers short after that, hoping he'd take the hint. But he didn't. He kept talking, asking why a girl like me was traveling alone, if I had a boyfriend, if I lived alone. I lied. I told him my boyfriend was waiting for me at home. I saw him watching me again through the mirror, and this time, his smile disappeared. That's when I noticed something even worse. We were supposed to take the next exit to my apartment, but we didn't. We passed right by it. I shot forward in my seat. That was my exit. He didn't even slow down. I said it again, louder. He glanced in the mirror, muttered a quick, "Sorry, I'll take the next one," and kept driving. My heart started racing. I tried to peek at his phone screen to see if he had the correct directions, but the angle made it impossible. A mile ahead, the next exit approached. I kept my voice calm but firm. "You need to get off here." For a moment, I thought he might ignore me again, but this time he sighed and turned on his blinker. As he exited, I noticed something disturbing. His jaw was clenched, and his hands were gripping the steering wheel tightly. Like he was annoyed. That's when he asked, "What's your boyfriend's name?" I felt a cold wave of fear wash over me. That wasn't small talk. That was a test. I forced out a random name, trying not to sound hesitant. He didn't respond. At that point, I needed to get out. I grabbed my AirPods and pretended to put on music, hoping he'd stop asking questions. At the same time, I texted my family and shared my location, just in case something went wrong. We were getting closer to my town, but the streets were empty. It was nearly 1 a.m., and not a single car was around. Then, at a red light, I saw it. A police car, parked in an empty lot nearby. And that's when I made my decision. I grabbed my bag, threw open the van door, and jumped out. The driver yelled after me, reaching for the power lock button, but I forced the door open before he could trap me inside. I ran straight for the police car. He didn't chase me, he just kept driving. That was the biggest red flag of all. I stopped running once I saw him disappear down the street. My hands were shaking as I reached the cop's car. He rolled down the window, eyebrows raised. I blurted out everything. How the taxi driver creeped me out, how he ignored my exit, how I had a bad feeling that he wasn't just being flirty. He was planning something worse. The cop let me in the back seat and drove me home. I thought that was the end of it. It wasn't. An hour later, just as I was drifting off to sleep, someone knocked on my front door. I froze. The knocks continued, slow, deliberate, then silence. A minute passed, then more knocks. I didn't move. I stayed completely still, my breathing shallow. I didn't know if it was him, but my gut told me it was. Eventually, the knocking stopped. The next day at work, my neighbor George called me. He asked if I was expecting my dad to stop by. I wasn't. He said a man had been outside my apartment checking the windows, acting like he was trying to get in. My stomach dropped. I called my dad. He had been at work all day. It wasn't him. I suddenly realized something. I had never given that taxi driver any money. If he was a real cab driver, wouldn't he have waited for me to pay? Or had he never intended to take me home at all? That night, I packed a bag and stayed at my parents' house for a week. My dad installed cameras on my front and back doors before I moved back in. I never used a taxi again, and I never figured out if he was an actual driver, or if he was someone using a stolen van, looking for a victim.